So this is the first Amateur Effect Weekly Outlook for the month of August. And as the new structure, it basically describes it or basically plays it out, I aim to cover monthly and weekly charts on in the first session of the month. And thereafter, when we do the weekly outlooks, the second, third, and fourth weekly outlook for the month, we'll just cover the daily chart downwards unless there's a major change to the weekly or monthly analysis, right? So let's get straight into it. We've got volatility 75 at the moment up on my screen. Um, can you guys please just drop a yes in the chat if you can see my volatility 75 chart before I go carry on? Okay, cool. Everyone can see it. Okay, cool. Thanks, guys. Thanks. Right. So as you guys can see, my analysis at the moment is fairly simple, fairly straightforward. I really don't look at too many things anymore. I try to keep it as simple as possible, and that way I can see as much information as possible. So looking at this chart here, I'm just going to be drawing on the chart a little bit with a pen, so that I can bring your attention to specific things. Now, you guys can see that volatility 75 has been in an uptrend, right? I don't really trade trend lines, but this trend line is on here just to sort of bring your attention to the fact that the market is currently bullish, right? Now we've got 1, 2 touches on this trend line, which means that regardless of what happens at this point, I'll be expecting to see price come back to this trend line at some point. Um, as you can see, that price basically created a new high here. This was basically the long-term structural high of this market. And as per my new strategy, we basically look at selling higher than the previous highs. So this little green zone that I've highlighted here is basically my monthly sell zone. And as you can see, that price is currently in the monthly sell zone at the moment. So we will be seeing some lower time frame impulse pushes to the downside. But overall, basically, we're looking for sales on this market. What I'll be expecting to see is maybe price driving into this level a little bit to the upside, perhaps even violating it slightly before we see that push to the downside to around this level here. And then we'll see a retest into this zone and this little purple line that I've got on here as well, retest into that area before we see price come down into this zone here. Obviously, this is the monthly chart, guys, so we shouldn't really expect to see this happening immediately. So the last thing you want to do is have this heightened expectation of taking sales now and having your TPs all the way down here, because all that's going to do for you is it's just going to make you hold your sales longer than you need to. And then you'll find yourself in drawdown when you were actually in a profitable position. On our weekly chart, we've got this weekly trend line that I've highlighted here as well. And as you can see on this weekly trend line, we've got multiple touches into this trend line. We've got a false breakout here, and we've got another false breakout all the way over here, and price is now currently back inside the trend line. So what I'll be expecting to see here on the weekly chart, just as the monthly chart as well, is I'll be expecting to see price pull down perhaps into this area around here, right? Before we see price push back to the upside again to form a new high on the weekly chart, because that's exactly what needs to happen, right? And then it will basically form like a minor trend line, that area there. And then you can look on the third touch into that. Oh, sorry about that. Sorry. Let's just get that back up. Guys, please drop a yes in the chat if you can see my screen again. Sorry about that. Thank you, Ronaldo. Let me just make my chart a bit smaller and move this to the downside. Okay, cool. All right, so like I said, basically I'll be looking to see this push up, right? This will basically be a second touch into like a minor trend line that's going to form at that point there, right? And then I'll expect to see it pull back down to the downside and then push back up again, and that will be the third touch into that area there. And if I basically bring my chart down a little bit more, you'll see that I've got a green zone highlighted there, and that will be my weekly sell zone. right? Obviously, this is not something that's going to happen immediately. So I just want to draw your attention to that. So you'll just expect a push to the upside, a pullback, maybe a minor violation of this trend line, and then another push to the upside into that area there, which is more or less where we'll be seeing those long-term sales come in to take it down to this area here and this zone here, where we'll be looking to take buys back for that monthly retest into this zone before those sells. Right, so just to clear that off the chart, and then we're going to drop down to the daily chart on this. Looking at the daily chart on VIX 75, we can see a huge influx of bullish momentum all the way from here to here. I hope some of you guys caught that long-term buy that I sent out on the paid chat or paid group chat, where we highlighted this level here as an area to look for buys, and we highlighted this area over here at the top as a TP area. As you guys can see, that played out really well. These buys came in at around on the 9th or 10th of July, and it played out basically throughout the month of July, right? However, moving forward, what I'd be looking to see on this daily chart is, as you can see, we've got areas here where price has basically rejected. So it's formed minor resistances at these areas here, right? Currently, you see price has the previous daily candle, which was yesterday's candle, has rejected at that area. So generally what I tend to see when price, when we have a rejection candle close like this, I would generally see price pull back into the area, push back up to violate that rejected candle, and that will form maybe a doji or a spinning top candlestick at that point there. Price will then pull back down again, perhaps to retest this level here and this trend line, and push back up to violate that area, and then we'll be seeing it pull back down. So as you guys can see, when we drop from the monthly, weekly, daily, we're seeing more or less the same thing: a small spike to the upside, a pullback, slight retracement to complete daily and weekly structure, and then we'll be seeing price push to the upside. So overall, more or less, we'll be looking to take those long-term sales from that area, but not without any minor rejections and pullbacks before we see it push into that area at the upside. Cool. So moving on from VIX 75. Right, so now we've got VIX 75 1S. This is a very new chart for me. It's not something that I've really looked at before, right? But I caught a really good buy on this over the weekend, and then I caught the sell back down. So it really got my attention because it's something that's moving really well at the moment. So I said, let me just throw this into our analysis as well. So I'm just going to zoom into this chart. Unfortunately, we can't really do much with the monthly chart because, as you guys know, this is a new synthetic. So there isn't any analysis I can do on this monthly chart. So we'll take our analysis from the weekly chart because we've got some substantial movement on the weekly, right? Looking at the weekly chart, I've highlighted this as my long-term sell zone. I've highlighted this as basically the TP zone for my buys that I'll be taking off the lower buy zone, right? So as you guys can see, price did tap into this level before and push to the downside, which is generally what we will see happening, right? However, in the long term, price will come back into this area again, right? Currently, all of these rejections here at the downside has brought my attention to this area here. So this little blue line that I've got highlighted there. Basically, what I'm expecting to see is that if price breaks above this area here, then it will be a long-term buy to the upside, and we'll be looking at price going back into the zone, right? Once price hits the zone, we'll be looking at taking it back down to the downside to violate these lows here, as there is institutional liquidity sitting below these lows. So as you guys might understand, or as I might have mentioned before, we look at buying lower than previous lows and selling higher than previous highs. That's why you can see here at the downside, I've got basically my buy zone way below these lows. Now, a lot of people will see these rejections and they'll be jumping in for those buys, which isn't really bad. Long term, those buys are still valid because they will lead to that movement into this zone here before we see price come down into this zone. And then perhaps we'll see our wick into the zone, and then we'll see price push back up to violate this area before we get a minor retracement off here and then a push to the upside. Right, so overall, we're bullish on volatility 75-1S, and this is on the weekly chart. Right, so I'm just going to drop down to the daily chart so we can get a clearer understanding. As we can see that there is major rejections here at the bottom, so I want us to get a clear understanding of where would be a good area for us to take those buys, as we would be basically catching the reversal, right? Not really a retracement, but the reversal, the minor reversal. Okay, looking at this daily chart over here, you guys can see I've got a minor sell zone highlighted there. Also, this would be a minor sell zone at this point, or a TP for the buy zone. So basically, we'll take a minor sell off this area here, right? Or we will TP for our buys at this area. Obviously, the buys, you can't just jump into a buy now. You need to have a clear understanding of more or less what's going to happen, right? So as you guys can see here, I've got this brown line highlighted here. So what I'm expecting to see is, I'm expecting to see price give us a small push to the upside to test this area here, or to test this trend line over here, right? We'll then see price pull back down into this zone with obviously the weak rejections to the downside, and then we'll see price turn around and go into this area here. We might get a small pullback off here before we see price come into that area and perhaps violate to the upside. Overall, bullish on this, still on the daily chart, still bullish as well. But we just have to have an understanding of what this movement is going to look like on the weekly, because remember, on the weekly, we're expecting a pull into this zone and then a push back down. So this area here is around 187, let's say let's call it 188, right? If you look at the daily chart, then that 188 is basically all the way up here, right? However, it's not something that's just going to happen all of a sudden. So the daily chart is going to play quite a bit of role in there. And we just need to expect those movements to happen prior to that break to the upside, to test that 188 level, which is more or less around here, right? I think I've got a bit of analysis here on the H4 chart as well. That is correct. I did highlight a couple of things on the H4 chart. Now, looking at the H4 chart, you guys can notice that, yes, I've got trend lines on my chart. I've got a few horizontal lines on my chart as well, but it's not really something that I use for trading. It's just these three zones that I highlight on the chart that I'm looking at trading out of those zones, right? Looking at this area over here, right? Now you can see price is reacting pretty strongly to that bullish momentum that we're seeing coming off these weekly rejections that we've got here. So that is completely understandable and completely expected. Okay, so looking at the H4 chart, right? So this is basically that momentum that we're seeing off those monthly rejections. If you look at this part here, basically, you can see these is basically those monthly rejections that we are seeing. And this zone over here, what we'll basically see is a retest into this area here, a touch into there. A push to the downside, right? Which should then lead into my H4 buy zone that I've got over here. And a lot of you guys will probably say, hey, Ryan, do you really expect it to get all the way down there? And yes, I do expect it to get down there. But it's not something that's going to happen immediately or instantaneously. Probably what we're going to see happening on this chart is this test into here, a push into the downside, a pull back, a push down, and then a push up to violate that area. So more or less like a bit of a W pattern, right? And that will basically form a 3 touch into this bottom trend line, 3 touch into this top trend line that will form there before we see that break to the upside. As you can see, this will be a false break of a trend line, and this is one of the reasons why I don't trade trend lines at the moment. So you'll see that false break to test this zone, push down to hit our buy zone, and then we'll see it push to the upside, right? Cool. So I'm just going to move on to our very next chart. Overall bullish bias on 75-1S. You just have to be wary of those zones that I've highlighted and that movement, and understand how the H4 is going to play into the daily, is going to play into the weekly, is going to play into the monthly movement. Once you understand how to use your time frames in conjunction with each other, you'll find it much easier for you to find those higher time frame setups and higher probability setups, sorry. So moving on, we've got volatility 100. And this is the monthly chart that we are currently looking at on volatility 100. As you can see, price was basically very bearish. We were in this long-term bearish movement, which was basically ever since the start of volatility 100. We see price formed an area of resistance or support here at the bottom, which it reacted very strongly to multiple times, and currently basically sitting in that area at the moment, but not really something I'm interested in. More or less what I'm looking at on this chart is I'm looking at pretty much the same thing. If you guys will notice, I have 3 zones on my charts. Generally what will happen is we'll see a test into the yellow zone, which will lead to a test into one of the green zones, which will lead to a test or a push into the other green zone, right? So that's basically what I look to see price doing, right? But to make you understand it a bit more in depth on this chart, I'll be expecting to see price pull into these levels around this area here, pull into that area, pull back, and then a test into this zone. We'll then see it push to the downside, or perhaps violate this zone to the upside, and that's purely dependent on how price reacts to this area here. But I'm expecting that the higher probability play will be to see it push to the downside for us to gather this liquidity that's basically sitting below these lows here. As you guys can see, there is a major battle that is currently being fought in this area here, hence the lack of volume in these candles. There's absolutely no volume in those candles. So once all the buy sell orders, the basic retail buy sell orders sitting in this area are consumed, we'll see price explode to the upside, right? Gather those orders that are sitting above here, push to the downside, gather all those orders that are sitting below here. When I say orders, what I'm talking about is retail traders. If you've sold here, basically you'll have a stop loss above there. If you've bought here, basically you'll have a stop loss below here, right? So basically gathering that liquidity sitting, which is all of those stocks sitting at that area, and that's how price will find liquidity to push in its actual direction that it's pushing in, right? Moving on to the weekly chart. As you guys can see on the weekly chart now, with volatility 100, I did send a sell setup, and price was sitting at more or less around this area about 2 weeks ago when I sent a sell setup. And as you guys can see, price reacted pretty strongly to that. We are expecting to see more movement to the downside purely based on that rejection that we see at this area here. I am expecting to see more movement to the downside. So perhaps a further push down into this area before we see price pull back down again into this area before we see it push up into this area. But overall, we're still bullish on this chart. After a test into this zone, this will basically be the highest probability buy on a long term, maybe for the next 2 to 3 weeks on volatility 100. Right? But at the moment, we're still short-term sell bias until we get into this area, and then we'll be looking to take some buys to violate this previous high here, violate that previous high, take some sells to the downside to that area before we take buys back up into that area. Apologies for my annotation at that point. But squiggly. So let's drop down to the daily chart so the daily can give us a bit more perspective on what that higher time frame movement is really going to look like. Now, as you guys can see, I've highlighted a bearish trend line that we've got here, not really looking at the trend line from that perspective to trade it. But as you guys can see, we've got 3 touches into that trend line. So we'll be expecting to see price push to the downside, right? what we'll basically see, however, is price. It's not really a good idea for you to take sales at this point, because what I'll be expecting to see is I'll be expecting to see a minor push to the downside, a break above here to gather that sell side liquidity on there, and then we'll see the market push to the downside. Probably, as you guys can see, there's a lot of confluences for a buy off this point back up, right? We've got this trend line here that price has pretty much been respecting. We've got our buy zone in that area, and then we've got this, basically you can call it a support or resistance, but basically it's structural, it's an institutional level that we've got sitting over here. So we'll see a minor violation of it together. This order's down there, and then we'll see it push to the upside to that area. Coolio. Moving on. I think, yeah, that's about it on the volatility 100. I just stopped at the daily chart. Moving on to volatility 50. We'll start from the monthly chart as well on this. Okay, moving on. So on this chart, as you guys can see, I've got my sell zone highlighted there, interim TP or sell zone highlighted here. And then at the bottom, right at the bottom, I'll have my buy zone basically highlighted at that point. Now, I've basically identified, if you trade these triangles, ascending triangles and all of that stuff, I've identified a bit of a symmetrical triangle that we've got here. And as you guys know, if you do trade all of these triangles and structures and stuff like that, you'll know that this is basically a continuation pattern. So what, aside from the fact that, you know, we've got this bearish trend, we've got this minor breakout here, I'll be looking to see price maybe play around a little bit around this area, push to the upside to hit my institutional zone there. Then I'll be looking to see price pull back into around these areas here before it pushes back to the upside to gather those orders at that point, and then we'll be taking sells back down. Ultimately, on a long-term basis, I'll be looking for buys off the bottom here to the upside. Not that I'm saying that price cannot violate this zone when it does get back into that area there, because what can alternatively happen is price can push into that zone, gather those orders before it pushes down into this area here. But what I'm basically seeing happening on this chart is I'm seeing a bit of a reversal or retracement. I would say reversal, not really a retracement, because a retracement is short term, right? So I would say a reversal is happening at this point on this chart because it has been bearish for a very long time. This is basically a fake out on the monthly chart. We'll be looking to see it perhaps break to the upside slightly, violate these highs over here, gather those sell side orders there, push to the downside, and then push back up again. Looking at our weekly chart, just gonna minimize this a little bit so that you guys can see it a bit more clearer. All right, looking at our weekly chart, as you guys can see, that price is almost at my sell zone on the weekly time frame, right? This is not highlighted based off the monthly chart or highlighted. It's based off purely what's happened in this area here that I've highlighted this as a sell zone, right? So just supporting what I've just said on the monthly chart, I'll be expecting to see it violate this area here and basically break those highs, and then I'll be looking to take sells back down into this area around here, push back up to violate that high, and that will basically create a 3-touch into that bit of trend line over there, and then we'll see it push to the downside to fetch those orders, those buy orders that are sitting right at the bottom of this chart. And as you can see, if I minimize that chart a bit more, you'll see that the long-term buys I'll be looking to take are off the bottom right here, right? So we'll be waiting to see this play out. Obviously, it'll give some good moves, some great opportunities for you to trade these entries that will happen at these points over here. But just be wary and be aware of these little fake outs and stuff like that that will happen in between. Looking at the daily chart. supporting again what we're seeing happening on the higher time frames, which is the monthly and weekly. You can see that on here as well, we've got a bit of a channel that's happening here, right? But what I want to bring you guys attention to in this instance is I've highlighted this little trend line that we've got here, right? And what I noticed when I highlighted this area here is I noticed that we haven't had a touch into this line for a very long time. So price has been very, very bullish, right? So this really supports my idea of the higher time frames, which is the fact that on the monthly we're going to see that reversal happening and price will then go bullish in long term, right? So what's essentially going to be expected on this chart is a minor pullback into this zone here, perhaps to retest some of the structure, a pushback to the upside to violate this low before we see price coming back down into this area. Should it not do that, then we'll simply be looking at price coming into this area before we take buys. But ultimately, price will come back to violate these highs before we see it push back down, right? So looking at this little purple line here, which are highlighted on the monthly time frame, you can see that that also supports price pulling back and perhaps violating this a bit to the upside before we see it pushing down again. And that will support for that little retest that we need to see happening basically on the monthly and the weekly time frame before we see price push to the upside. Here we can even get wicks into the downside just to fetch these orders that will be sitting here in my daily buy zone. And very lastly, moving on to volatility 10. Now on here on volatility 10, I did send a really good buy setup a couple weeks back as well. It did play out very slightly, but not to the extent that I was actually hoping that it would or expecting it to, right? So what I'm looking to see happening on this chart here is I'm still pretty much buy bias on this chart. And all I'm expecting to see is basically a retest into this level here, right? We might violate it slightly to the upside or even move on to fetch those buy orders or those sell side liquidity that's sitting at that zone. So we'll see price push back down into this area before we see price push up and violate that to the upside. As you guys can see, we have been bearish for a very long time on here. So we are expecting to see a retracement happening on this. Not really a retracement, sorry, a reversal. So we'll be watching this to play out. But currently I am bullish on this. And as you guys can see, price is reacting very strongly to this little level that we've got here at the bottom, this little spike here. So we'll be looking to take buys. If you're taking buys on this on the lower time frames, that buy should lead into around, oh shit, sorry about that. That buy should lead into around this area here. But if it does break to the upside, then that will basically be a confluence for us to take those long-term buys into this zone there before we see the pushback to the downside. Might not even reach all the way down here because we need to be wary of the fact that this is in the middle of a retreat, a reversal at the moment. So it might not reach our buy zone all the way down here. But on the lower time frames, we will more or less see wicks into this area here. So we might result with just a quick push into this area to gather those zones before we push it back up. And that looks like a little kitty cat, but that's not by, that's not on purpose. Dropping down to the weekly time frame. Looking at the weekly time frame, we can see price has basically violated. So if you trade support and resistance, this is basically a very strong level of support, right? So price will basically retest into that and give those support and resistance traders basically an opportunity to take sells from that area over there, retest into this little monthly trend line that we've got there, tip into our buy zones that we've got highlighted at this point, and then we'll see price push into the upside. From here, I'll be looking to take sells back down into this area over there, perhaps a retest into this little support and resistance that I was referring to, and then we'll see price push back into that area. At this point, I'm expecting to see sells come back into this market, perhaps the final retest into this zone over here before we see price violate that and push to the upside. So overall, I would say bullish bias on this on the weekly time frame and monthly time frame, but we're going to drop down to the daily time frame to obviously look for better opportunities and better entries. So in this area here, we've got a, sorry, I didn't really highlight much on this chart, right? So as you guys can see, I did highlight the fact that we'll see a push to the upside, which is supported by this little trend line, which is supported by that area that I spoke of as support and resistance at that point. And then we'll see it push back to the downside, retest that area over there before we see it push back to the upside. This can lead to either a wick into this little trend line, this monthly trend line that we've got running at the bottom here, before we see price push back to the upside. Right, cool, guys. So that's it from my side. I hope I shed some sort of light in terms of our long-term expectation of what we should see happening over the next couple of weeks, over the next couple of months. And that will be basically our long-term interpretation of these charts, right? For our intraday setups, I will be sending out intraday setups, and that's for our daily H4, H1, and M15 chart. And as those setups progress, I will be updating those setups and sending them out. That will be sent out in our premium group, but I will also send perhaps a few setups in the trial group as well, so you guys can also take advantage of a few of these opportunities. Right, so that's it from my side, guys. I just want to give you guys an opportunity to ask a few questions. So if you have any questions, feel free to unmute yourself, or you can type it in the chat. I'm going to give you guys about 10 minutes, and you can get your questions out the way. So I'll take it. Nobody has any questions? Um, Guys, regarding the premium group, okay, so we've just got a question regarding the premium group. The premium group subscription increases each and every month, right? The reason for that is because I believe for the quality of services that I give, we charge a very, very low premium at this point, right? So the premium group subscription goes up each and every month. So currently the subscription is at $60, right? And at the end of this month, that subscription will either go up to $70 or $75 at the end of this month. And I did explain this on a webinar a week and a half or 2 weeks ago, but just to cover it as well, the subscription will increase each and every month until it hits a specific figure, right? So I'm looking at capping it at around perhaps $200 to $250, right? So it's going to continuously increase each and every month until it hits that figure, basically. But that figure is not really set in stone at this point. I'm still basically toying around with what I want to cap it at. But at this point, each and every month, the subscription will increase. All right, cool, guys. So any other questions before I end the session? Not a problem, Ronaldo. You know, it's always a pleasure for me to share. Thanks for showing up. It's been a while since we've seen you on one of these sessions. But yeah, it's not a problem, bro. Just a reminder, I did post this on the trial group as well. I will be sending you guys a private reminder as well. Remember, the trial was for 30 days, and for a lot of you guys who did join very early on, around the 7th, I think, when I did start up the group, that would mean that your trial period will basically expire on the 6th of August. So I will be sending you guys a private reminder with the actual dates as to when your not really a subscription, but when your trial will expire, right? And obviously, on the date when your trial does expire at midnight, we will have you removed from that group. If you are interested in joining any of our other services, or should I say our premium group, you can hit me up. I did also explain a few other things as well, but I'll obviously put that webinar up on YouTube one of the days so that you guys can have access to that information. Right, so I take nobody has any other questions. It's been a pleasure as always, guys, to have you guys on the session and for me to get the opportunity to share information with you guys. Um, Pleasure as always. Enjoy the rest of your evening. To the rest of the guys, I'll catch up with you tomorrow morning and I'll share a few setups with you guys as well. Until next time, amateur over and out.